Good evening, everyone. My name is Suki Law, Vice President of Human Resources here at Science World. I just want to say welcome to everyone here, and I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Tonight, we are absolutely thrilled to be hosting the second event of the To Catch a Falling Sky Conversation Series in partnership with Simon Fraser University Faculty of Environment and the Pacific Water Research Center. The To Catch a Falling Sky series embodies the very essence of our convening mandate here at Science World. That is to hold events for dialogues and to bring communities together around difficult and sometimes even controversial topics, and that is right at the intersection of science and society. Science World's vision is that within a generation, Canada will be a country of thriving, sustainable communities rooted in science, innovation, and a deep connection to nature. And we believe our vision can be achieved by creating and delivering inspiring and memorable connections with STEAM, and for communities to convene on pressing issues like what we'll be talking this evening. I want to thank Simon Fraser University and Pacific Water Research Center for being such terrific community partners and for assembling this gathering tonight on an important topic. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Andy Wright, adjunct professor in the Faculty of Environment at Simon Fraser University and a close friend here of ours here at Science World, who will be setting the stage for our conversation this evening. Welcome again.
So we have a bit of a ripple effect because I'm immediately going to abdicate on my responsibilities to introduce everybody. My role here tonight is to tell you where the title of the series comes from, which is To Catch a Falling Sky. And it is a shout out, if you like, to embrace a positive future where solutions can and will prevail to the issues, particularly of energy, sustainability and climate change. But broader than that, to create an ethos by which we can change things for the positive. It was born of my close friend's daughter driving to school in his truck. He's a general contractor. And Rieva and Ron were listening to the radio, and an environmental zealot was going on about how the sky is falling and the end of the world is nigh. And this poor 12-year-old got out of the car in absolute tears, saying, "Why the heck am I bothering, Dad?" and walked into school. And Ron was coming to my place afterwards, and he turned up, and he was quite gutted by that experience. So that is the motivation for this, is because, yes, we do have very real problems, and I don't mean to shy away from that, but I also think we have very real solutions, and we need to talk about them and how to get them actuated and happening. And that is the spirit here, is that we are talking about positive solutions. And one of those spaces is tonight's talk is from our First Nation community members, and to hear their vision on how the future may unfold. So I'm now going to introduce Professor Adil Zafir from Simon Fraser University. He heads up the Pacific Water Research Center, and so I'm going to abdicate to Adil, who's going to introduce our speakers for the evening. So here's Adil. Welcome on stage.
Thank you very much, Andy. And I would also like to add my thanks to the Science World for giving us this wonderful opportunity to carry out this series, which creates a dialogue space for issues that are sometimes not easily discussed or sometimes which are relating to our future. So the conversation today is going to be about how First Nations move forward. And of course, any conversation on these topics has to start with the interrelated themes of governance, reconciliation, self-determination. So that's kind of the backdrop in which the discussion will carry out. When we were planning for this talk, we had agreed that the geographic scope we will constrain for tonight to the First Nations in British Columbia. So you'll see that's how the selection of the speakers has taken place as well. So the theme of the series as a whole, as Andy was just talking about, relates to sustainable use of water, energy, and food, and to assure that it's secure for everyone, and certainly in this case, security of those resources for First Nations. So the other point, which also Andy highlighted, we have agreed that we would focus more on success stories and on forward-looking thinking more so than problem description. So I think that hopefully will lead to some really interesting and interactive dialogue, which is the purpose of this series. I want to put a pin in the discussion also because there is a very interesting conference taking place on Wednesday and Thursday of next week. It's called the Indigenous Green Economy Conference. And the organizers of that conference have been very kind, and they've given us a space inside of that conference to carry forward the discussion that we're going to have here and to relate it to a much larger First Nations audience. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity. And as Andy said, we're very keen to get questions from you, to have a lively debate that will generate these key points that we will take forward. So that concludes my introduction of what we are doing today. It's my pleasure now to start with our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Cliff Atleo, who's a Tsimshian and Nuu-chah-nulth a scholar who researches Indigenous governance, community development, and political economy. Like me, he's also a faculty member and assistant professor at SFU's School of Resources and Environmental Management. His doctoral research focused on the political economy of Nuu-chah on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And in both historical and contemporary context, he's interested in how Indigenous communities navigate, adopt, resist mainstream capitalism while working to sustain their unique cultural identities, practices, and worldviews. So please join me in welcoming Cliff Atleo.
Thank you, Adil. Okay, so that's my English name. I have three Indigenous names. I'm Nuu-chah-nulth and Tsimshian. So my Nuu-chah-nulth name is Cha-chim-muthni. It's from the House of Clackaschbeath of the Ahousaht community, or Ahus, as we say. And on my mother's side, she's from Kitsillat. She's Tsimshian, and from the House of Nish-Haiwas, I carry two names. Smoigit Nisnaya, which was a name I was given recently, last spring. And then for some time, I've also been known as Gamayam, is also a Tsimshian name from the House of Nish-Haiwas. So we live in the era of reconciliation in Canada. But what does that really mean? One of the matriarchs of the House of Nish-Haiwas, I had lunch with her. She's my aunt, my mom's older sister. She came down for a medical appointment, and she just brought up, we were having dinner yesterday with my kids and my aunt, or my two aunts actually, and she said, I don't know how, I think it was the Gerald Butts thing and the Jody Wilson-Raybould and Trudeau, these committee, Justice Committee testimonies. And she brought up Trudeau and she brought up reconciliation and basically said, reconciliation doesn't mean anything to me in the context of this particular government. And of course, a lot of Indigenous peoples feel, to some extent, betrayed by Trudeau. But certainly the language of reconciliation has changed over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to action, the inquiry into missing murdered women, we're certainly engaging in these discussions a lot more. My university, Simon Fraser University, is in the process of trying to implement its, it did an extensive review and report and its responses to the TRC calls to action. And you might recall a couple of years ago, Trudeau, it was like an end of the year kind of press conference that he gave. So this was like, probably sometime between Christmas and New Year's, or right around the end of the year after his first year. He talked about decolonizing the government of Canada. Does anybody remember that? I don't know how much it got picked up on, but I remember being interviewed by one of the local radio stations here about what he meant. And so I'm not even going to get into that argument, if you will, simply keeping it within the realm of reconciliation as we're currently talking about it. And in terms of this series, which is about challenges and solutions, I wanted to introduce 4 contexts, if you will, or 4 things to keep in mind when we consider Indigenous communities in this province, especially as issues have arisen in the news with things like the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the not only the opposition to the Kinder Morgan pipeline, but the ambivalence amongst different Indigenous communities about it. Some of you may have seen in the news that it's something like 43 Indigenous communities had signed impact benefit agreements between Alberta and British Columbia. 33 of those communities were in British Columbia. It's certainly not a black and white issue. And then more recently, amongst the Wet'suwet'en people, they were expressing opposition to natural gas pipelines in their territories. So some of you might have heard of the Unistoten camp, which has been in place now for at least 10 years. There was also, so January 7th, I believe, the RCMP raided the Gidimt'en checkpoint, a neighboring clan of the Wet'suwet'en, of the Unistoten, amongst the Wet'suwet'en. So obviously these issues are still present. They're still related to Indigenous claims to self-determination, negotiations, and ongoing tensions with the police, with the government, with corporations. So there's 4 things that I want you to keep in mind as we get into these discussions. The first one is quite simply Indigenous self-determination. According to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue economic, social, and cultural development. The UN Declaration also, germane to our conversations here, in Articles 10, 11, 19, 28, 29, and 32, brings up the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, which obviously is a big debate when it comes to Indigenous peoples and resource development. Namely, the question, does that mean that Indigenous peoples have a veto? And my short take on the idea of Indigenous self-determination is that this is something that Indigenous peoples have not given up. And it's certainly unique also to a place like British Columbia, where for the most part, other than the northeastern corner of the province, which is covered under Treaty 8, and some of the more historic treaties like the Douglas Treaties on the southern part of Vancouver Island and a little bit on the north part of Vancouver Island, most of the province has not been settled by treaty. Now, there are some recent comprehensive claims like the Nisga'a, the Tsawwassen Agreement, and a few others out there. But for the most part, technically, even under colonial law, historical colonial law, most of the province hasn't been dealt with in any kind of legal fashion. Hence, when we hear introductions and recognitions these days, people talk about the unceded territories, where the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam have not formally given up their right to these territories, even though they are certainly occupied by the City of Vancouver and neighboring municipalities, and there is de facto assertion by the Crown. So just to sort of keep that in mind, many Indigenous communities still believe that they have a right. I really like the way the Wet'suwet'en put it. If you look at their Unistoten website, they describe themselves not as demonstrators, not as protesters, despite the way the media describes them. They are simply Indigenous people, Wet'suwet'en, from various clans that are occupying their territory and defending that territory against outsiders, against the RCMP, against corporations, province of British Columbia, or the federal government. The second thing that I want to highlight in terms of a context is the idea of settler colonialism. And this is really simply that colonialism in Canada is not simply historical, it is ongoing. There have been a bunch of academics like Wolf, Veracini, my supervisor for my PhD, Isabel Altamirano Jimenez, who've talked about settler colonialism as a very specific phenomenon that we live with. And I think former Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court, Antonio Lemaire, put it very succinctly in the Delgamuukw ruling. He said, "Let's face it, we're all here to stay." So what does this mean in terms of discussions about decolonization or reconciliation? It's important to keep that in mind because certainly Indigenous peoples will recognize among all people that there are no easy solutions here. The third context that I want to bring up is environmental politics. Obviously, British Columbia has been a hotbed for environmental politics. Greenpeace was founded here. I'm assuming, therefore, the Sea Shepherd Society was also founded here when they broke off from Greenpeace. In my father's territory, the War in the Woods, Clayoquot Sound, 1993 really established this sort of global template in terms of resisting unsustainable forest practices or environmental activism. And there has always been a tension there that has not always been very public amongst environmentalists and Indigenous peoples. And the reason I bring this up is that through time, there have been lots of stereotypes about Indigenous peoples, and one of them has been the noble savage, or as Paul Nadasdy at Cornell University puts it, the ecologically noble Indian. There's another academic named Bruce Braun who wrote a book called The Intemperate Rainforest about Clayoquot Sound, specifically that conflict and the tension between environmental groups and Indigenous peoples. And one of the things that he tries to point out or highlight is that there is no simple binary between what he called destructive humanity and pristine nature. He also pointed out that one of the impacts of that, or one of the results of that positioning by environmental groups, is it had may not have been the intention. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening with that. Maybe I'm just speaking right into it. It had the intention of erasing contemporary indigeneity. The positioning of, on the one hand, pristine, the language of the environmental groups at that time was full of that, like untouched, virginal, all these things that you would think about personifying the place as being completely unoccupied. And on the other hand, human beings being destructive. And certainly there were destructive practices going on, unsustainable forest practices, but where that left Indigenous peoples was that if we were not in canoes and not using speedboats and not using paddles or spears as opposed to rifles, that we had somehow lost our indigeneity. We had somehow lost our way. So that there was this ongoing tension, like I said, that it had not necessarily been, not something that we continue necessarily to talk about. So one of the questions I've been asking in my research is, have times changed? And I think to some extent they have. A lot of people have been talking about the Burnaby Mountain, the Trans Mountain opposition, the Watch House, the leadership of the Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish and other Indigenous peoples. But the particular protests that were going on in 2017, 2018 had a similar kind of resonance to Clayoquot Sound, I think. People coming from around the world, people coming from around the country and the continent, and not simply Indigenous peoples protesting something, but this sort of connection, or at least these efforts to establish solidarity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Okay, the fourth context that I want to bring up tends to be a trickier one. Sometimes I have people ask me why I'm picking on the billionaires. So the fourth context to think about is neoliberal capitalism. Now, I know that's an academic mouthful, but thinking about the things when we think of capitalism, free markets, efficiency, innovation, the invisible hand of the market, competition, rational self-interest, the fact that if we all just basically look out for ourselves in the marketplace, we'll somehow magically look out for everybody, profit maximization, endless growth. A lot of these things are associated with capitalism, but I think more succinctly, in terms of the time we're in right now, neoliberal capitalism is a very real thing. So this is something that has accelerated since the 1970s. If you think of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama talked about at the end of the Cold War, the sort of victory of liberal democracy. There's a lot of things, and I'm not going to get too in-depth into it with respect to the theory, but just to point out that capitalism is not a monolith. It's highly adaptable. Kind of like those, I was listening to a program on CBC about superbugs, antibiotic-resistant superbugs. That's what I think about when I think of capitalism. One of my colleagues in the geography department at SFU, he also has a concept that he works with called actually existing capitalism, so kind of separating what we would think about from Adam Smith and Ricardo and Hayek, and more of sort of how is capitalism acting on the ground? How is it affecting real people? You might have heard a statistic about how household incomes haven't really increased for people since Thatcher and Reagan. Basically stayed roughly the same. Thomas Piketty wrote, writes about increasing inequity. I remember seeing a news report that said that we are now entering a time again where we haven't seen this much inequity, we haven't seen this much concentration of wealth or degree of monopoly, strength of monopolies since like 1900. So if you look back and you look at the antitrust busting they were doing, breaking up the steel companies, breaking up the electric companies, breaking up the oil company, which turned into like 5 big oil companies. We're getting to that point with like Apple and Amazon and other companies where we're starting to see those concentrations of wealth again, which I think should be of concern to people. But a specific interest to me in my research has been how has this actually existing capitalism, how has it affected Indigenous peoples? In my PhD research, I looked at the various sort of subsistence practices of our communities. We were traditionally a whaling people. We also hunted seals, sea otters. And if you look at like a political economy or historical political economy of the West Coast, you could see the industrialization or the colonists engaging in these resource extraction industries, if you will, commercial whaling, pelagic seal hunting, the fur trade with sea otters, forestry, commercial fishing. Almost all of these things, all of these resources were driven almost to the point of collapse or extinction. Our communities on the West Coast, we participated quite heavily in the commercial fishing industry throughout the 20th century. At our height, we had over 200 owned Nuu-chah-nulth, owned and operated Nuu-chah-nulth fishing vessels of various sizes, from trawlers to gill netters to seine boats. So boats with crews of anywhere from 2 to 6 people. And if you figure that we were probably at about 6,000 or 7,000 people at the time, almost every family was connected to the fishing industry in some way. Either they had a direct relative who was fishing, they were working in a fish processing plant. When the Nuu-chah-nulth, the Hauset, and several of our neighboring First Nations launched a court case in 2002 to reestablish a presence in the fishery, we had 6 fishermen left and 10,000 people. So we went from within a generation to a point where almost everybody was involved, maybe arguably in an industry that was not sustainable the way it was being run by DFO, to a point at the beginning of this millennia where almost nobody was involved in fishing, where even to get food fish for communities, we would often have to hire boats from other communities because there was only 6 boats out there left at that point in time. So we had to hire people to come catch fish and help share those within our communities where we didn't have fishermen. And we're still fighting that battle. So the case launched in 2002. I'm not sure of the exact dates. We won at the appeal court, or we won at the BC Supreme Court. Canada sought leave to appeal at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, we will not hear your appeal, basically upholding that lower court decision. And then just, I think it was 3 weeks ago maybe, we're back in court again because Canada wants to justify infringement of our rights. So we're still not any closer. I don't know how many millions of dollars we spent, but it's sort of an ongoing, frustrating process. And I want to quote one of my, I guess I would say, fellow researchers of Indigenous economic development, David Newhouse. He's an Onondaga scholar at Trent University. And this was his perspective on capitalism in the year 2000 when he published an article. He wrote, "We have participated at the edges of capitalism as laborers, as small business people, as debtors. Now we seek to enter its heart. We will be transformed by it. Capitalism will absorb Aboriginal cultures, and the moral order of Aboriginal societies will be changed." I really hated that the first time I read that. And I didn't like David Newhouse. It's kind of like when I first read Thomas Hobbes. I thought he was a jerk. In retrospect, reading it second and third times, I find it was chilling. He was chillingly accurate about the power of capitalism. Is anybody here a fan of Star Trek? So Newhouse has some early articles around 2000, 2002, where he calls capitalism the Borg. So if you're familiar with Star Trek, the Borg is like this hive race. They basically travel around the universe, absorbing cultures into them. They say your unique, your species' uniqueness will be absorbed into the whole, and you will be made better. And then kind of their line is resistance is futile, which was kind of the perspective that I think Newhouse was taking. To be fair to him, in his later writings, he did sort of open the door to the idea of resistance or strategic resistance in the ways in which Indigenous peoples could perhaps mitigate or sort of offset some of the more harmful aspects of capitalism. But I think, like I said, in his early writings, I think he was being very accurate about what we were dealing with. Sometimes Indigenous peoples resist, and sometimes they engage. And oftentimes they're vilified either way, either as sellouts or either as reactive troublemakers. I like the way also Dene scholar Glenn Coulter at UBC, one of the ways he writes about it in his book is that when Indigenous people say no to destructive development, it is not simply a reactionary negative thing. It is only if you look at it from the lens of Canada. But what he's also saying is that when Indigenous people say no, they are simultaneously saying yes. They are saying yes to their own laws, their own traditions, their own principles and values, which they still have not entirely forgotten. So one of the things that I like to stress with people, like the Wet'suwet'en, is that they still believe that they hold the right to self-determination, that they have not lost it, and are still very much interested in negotiating a new relationship or a revived relationship with Canada. So I hope I've given you something to think about as we engage in these discussions. As Adil said, my point isn't to harp on the past necessarily, but to give you an accurate picture, or at least my own assessment of where we're at now, so that when we do move forward, when we do try to work together on these issues, that we're being very realistic about that. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Judith Sayers. I'm not going to give you a really long biography, but she is the president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. She's the former chief of the Huipitchisiut First Nation. And she also was very recently a recipient of the Order of Canada for her leadership on clean energy, specifically Huipitchisiut's run-of-the-river microhydro project. So Judith is a fellow Nuu-chah-nulth and somebody I admire very much. And I'll hand it over to you, Judith.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all here tonight on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It's funny, when I was reading what this was about, for some reason my mind went to catch a falling star. And I guess just because that's the phrase that we all hear. And so I was thinking, that's really interesting. And I was thinking about trying to catch a star. But when you think about a falling sky, how much more comprehensive is that? And I think it just really shows where we are in this day and age in global warming, that it is the biggest crisis facing mankind. And what are we doing about it? As First Nations, there's a lot of things. I think Cliff gave you a great summary of people who are First Nations people who are trying to stop development in their territory because of the increased greenhouse gases, because of the effects on the territory. And that's one way, and you hear about that a lot. Another way that I've been involved in is that First Nations have been trying to get involved in the clean energy industry and have been since the early 2000s. We embraced an industry that could create wind energy, run-of-the-river, geothermal, solar, all those natural resources that are out there waiting to be used in order to stop nuclear development, burning liquid natural gas, and all those alternative forms of creating energy. Of course, in British Columbia, we're blessed with a lot of water, and there's a lot of large dams that provide us with the power to turn on our lights. And so as First Nation, we embrace that vision, we embrace that dream. Let's get into the clean energy industry. Let's make a difference, sustainable development. It's in line with our values. Minimal impact on the land, on the water, in the air, making use of the sun. It's something that we could really embrace and get involved in. So as Nuu-chah-nulth, we are one of the first people, First Nation, to build a project on our own. We own 72.5%. Coulter First Nation owns 10%. And we have a private developer that owns 12.5%, and we gave 5% to the city of Port Alberni for their cooperation. I didn't know anything about clean energy, but they were trying to build a cogeneration plant in our territory. Well, I guess it was a generation plant. First of all, they tried to do a cogen, and then they did a generation. And we were really worried about when they burned the natural gas, it had this particulate matter. And for those of you who know Port Alberni, and we've had pulp mills forever, and, you know, we've had a lot of issues with the lungs, and, you know, and this particulate matter goes right into the bottom of your lungs, and we were worried about that. We're worried about it falling on our cedar trees and our medicinal plants and stunting the growth. And there was a lot of things that we fought against. But we realized we can't always say no. We have to be part of the solution. And what is that solution? So we built China Creek and had to learn about energy, clean energy, about the grid. I was blown away the first time I went to the first Clean Energy BC conference, because I didn't realize there was all these moving parts. And, you know, I knew about the law and all those kinds of things, but it was really opened my eyes, and I kind of embraced the industry, and through the years have built my expertise in it. And more First Nations started saying, oh, look what Nuu-chah-nulth is doing. Let's do it too. And people started, because up until that point in time, you know, there's a lot of clean energy projects going up to Whistler, and the First Nations in the area decided that they didn't want to be equity owners, they just wanted royalties. So we were the First Nation to actually be involved in a project and to own so much, own and develop it. And so we tried to work with other First Nations to help them build projects. So all across British Columbia now, we have 125 First Nations out of 203. They're involved in some way in clean energy. Can you imagine? 125 out of 203. We did a survey a few years back with you, Vic, and we found that 95% of the First Nations in the province wanted to be or were involved in clean energy. That's how exciting this industry was to them. That's how in line with our way of thinking and what we wanted to do. So more and more First Nations started building projects. And then the NDP government decided to continue with Site C. Of course, the decision was started with the Liberals, came to the NDP. The NDP knew that Site C is going to create far too much energy for our needs. They knew that. They knew they would have to stop buying power from First Nations that were going to build clean energy. They've stopped buying power from any independent power producers. This is an industry that's about a $16 billion industry in British Columbia, 17,000 jobs. And they just killed us. That's it. No more until some future date when the province needs a lot more energy. So what are we doing in our communities? We're trying to get off the grid. We're trying to, in all of our office buildings, might be a windmill, might be solar panels, might be a geothermal. We're trying to all become grid independent. You know this huge, horrible storm we had before Christmas? Some of our communities are without power 10 days and more because the grid went down. If we had our own microgrids, we had our own source of power, they wouldn't have had to lose all the meat and fish in their fridge for the freezer for the year. You know, they're trying to defeat us again, this government. They're trying to say, oh, well, you know, maybe you can't do clean energy, but we'll work on economic development. What do you guys want to do? You know, and then here, in the survey, we found out that First Nations wanted to build projects that was more than $7.7 billion investment in the province. $7.7 billion. What a huge opportunity to bring in revenue to the communities, jobs. The great thing about clean energy projects, green energy projects, is that they're regional. They're in every corner of this province. They bring jobs, they bring revenue into that community. They pay taxes for the water, for the land. It's a great generator for everybody. Site C is up there. They're going to employ 25 people when it's finished. 25. Whereas we could have thousands of jobs across the province in First Nations and with other power producers. So we're going to try and still build our skills so that, if the opportunity does come along, we can build our solar farm, sell it to the grid. On the south end of Vancouver Island, they wanted to build a huge wind farm. They were going to work with one of the forest companies, believe it or not, and build this 200 megawatt wind farm. But BC Hydro won't buy it for them. And so what do? You kind of have to do what you have to do. You can put, use electricity, and BC Hydro does have a net metering program, and so, you can put your power into the grid, and so then you don't pay for your electricity, and if you don't use as much electricity, you get a credit on your bill. So that's kind of what we're reduced from. We're reduced from being able to make, a good economic opportunity down to selling a small amount of power, paying for your electricity, which we can use money for other things. And so a lot of people are talking about grid independence as one of the ways to go. And because everybody is so excited about clean energy, we're going to continue that way. So that's one way I think that we're trying to help mitigate and to stop, other types of energy being created because, they had to pass a law, Gordon Campbell's government and Clean Energy Act. They stopped coal, they stopped the Burrard Thermal, and they were all into independent power producers. And so that's one thing that we're doing. I wanted to share with you as well, within our territories, a lot of our Nuu-chah-nulth communities are fairly remote, and a large part of the land is privately owned, and there's huge forest companies out there, and both on the Crown and private lands. And their practices of logging is not a very good one. And so what we end up is having our salmon streams destroyed because, logs are dragged through the creeks, or, people drive their cars through them, trucks. And it's not every company, it's not everywhere. But up in the northern region, and so this would include Mawachet-Muchla, they're around the Gold River area. And we've got Nuu-chah-nulth and Hadasat, and they're up around Zabalas and Cayucot. So this is on the north end of the island. And their salmon are very few. And we know that the oceans are warming, and that's an issue. We know that there's all kinds of predators out there as well. So what we're working on for the northern region is what we call Salmon Parks. We want to set aside 11 salmon-bearing streams and create parks around them so that we can't have the logging going on. We're starting to negotiate this with the governments right now. We're trying to get some money from the federal government. But how can we help our salmon? How can we restore, what was something that was important to us, basically for food, but as Cliff described, that was a great part of our economy. Can we bring the stocks back up? Because right now, the issues in the ocean and the herring haven't been coming back. And so, the northern region again has said, no, you're not going to do herring fishing in our territories. And DFO doesn't want to listen. What are we going to have to do? Remember this happened to the Healthsick a couple of years ago? They wanted to go fishing for herring. And so they did a lot of protests. I remember because we were in Victoria at the time, and we all went to the Save-On where Jimmy Pattison owned, and we kind of blockaded the parking lot. Well, didn't really blockade it. We kind of walked around and around and around in it. We were protecting and defending. Let's Save-On. No. But, you know, so we sent a message, and they, you know, DFO finally backed off and came to an agreement with the health sec. So that's a key factor in climate change, is the ability of First Nations to manage our territories like we always have. You know, we used to do controlled burns in the forests so that we wouldn't get these forest fires, but we're not allowed to do that anymore. So a lot of these huge forest fires we're experiencing now because of the climate change, the heat is happening. A lot of our traditional knowledge in managing our lands is really key and important to being able to do these things. So when First Nations talk about asserting our jurisdiction, you know, and Cliff described the declaration as being free, prior, and informed consent. You know, we've been talking about joint management, co-management, shared decision making. Let's sit down together and come to a decision that we can work together on. We're not even close. We're not even close. Trudeau says no doesn't mean no. You know, and so that's frustrating. But, you know, if we're going to go and help catch that falling sky, we need to have that jurisdiction over our territories. We need to have a strong role in the management of our territories, over our resources. You know, we never caught the first run of fish going up the river. Never. Because they were the leaders. They brought the other fish behind them where they needed to go. After they went up, then he started catching the fish. And there's a lot of knowledge like that in our territories, with our elders, with our knowledge keepers, that we can share and we can help to manage. We've never faced climate change before. And we're facing fires, we're facing flooding like we've never seen before, erosion of lands. But we can help. But the governments don't like to acknowledge that. The federal government gives the money to the province, says, BC wildlife, wildfires, emergency, you guys deal with this money and go fight the fires. Meanwhile, back at home on the reserve, do we see the helicopters? Do we see anybody helping to come fight our fires? Our guys are on the line, they don't have proper equipment, but they're protecting their homes. And this picture has got to change. And that's what we're working on. We're working on having that control back, the finances, and working on clean energy. And one of the great things about clean energy I forgot to mention was, because food is part of this, is that a lot of our First Nations are remote. And it might take an hour, 2 or 3 to get to the grocery store. And then when they get to the grocery stores, the cost of fruit and vegetables is huge. And so a lot of our First Nations are building greenhouses in their communities, and they're growing vegetables, and they're using solar panels to heat those greenhouses. And it's working, because now all of a sudden, all of the village has fresh vegetables. And it's a great thing for food sovereignty and people feeling like they can look after themselves again and not having to, you know, because a lot of our people just say, we can't afford to buy vegetables. Sorry. I mean, you know, and we're away from our traditional diet. But anyway, so those are some of my suggestions and some of the things that I see us doing, and there's probably many more, but I think I've probably talked over my 10 minutes. But I have the honor of working with Cliff earlier when we used to do trade negotiations way back when, and I've watched him climb up through the academics to get his doctorate, and which is really exciting. And so I'm happy to be here tonight, happy to work with Cliff and SFU on this. And it's my honor to introduce to you our next speaker, which is Dara Kelly. Dara also has her doctorate from the Auckland University and in business. And right now she works with SFU in Indigenous business, and she's really got some great ideas, and I know you're going to be excited to hear from her. So, Dara?
So, Swell, Ami Kutwila Makwat, Talitsalqualacamal, Talitsalquatsai Alice, Dara Kelly till squeak, Quiquihas till squeak. So what I just said is good day. I'm from the Leq'a First Nation, which is part of the Stalo communities up the Fraser River. The name Leq'a means a place on the Fraser that is calm and flat. And this is a signifier of the economic history of my father's community within the broader landscape of a feasting economy, which is what I'm going to talk about today. My borrowed name is Dr. Dara Kelly. I'm an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. I'm at the Beatty School of Business. And it's a really exciting time because the title that I hold is a professor of Indigenous business. And this is the first position in North America of this nature. So it's really exciting. I got my doctorate at the University of Auckland Business School, and I spent 9 years down there completing both my master's and my PhD. And so what I talk about, the knowledge that I'm going to share today, a lot of the the mentorship that I received and the training that I received at the University of Auckland, you'll see that as being a strong influence in my work and my approach to the research that I do. But I do that research within the context of my own community now. So what I'm going to share with you actually is a poem that is written by a very good friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Katy Dell. She's also a professor at the University of Auckland Business School, and she's a poet. So this poem is called Forgotten Speak. My ancestors spoke a language we now don't seem to know. The talk of trees, lakes, and rivers and seas. A forgotten speak that is nearly gone. A piwaiwaka dances to warn a death is on the way. While a komiromiro nearby tells you good news should arrive today. A kofi speaks in flowers, announcing the kina are fat to eat, and the company of a fe means mama's puku hums a new heartbeat. Can you hear the voice of water or messages in the wind? A conversation doesn't need to have sound, but can be dialogue that's heard within. So I chose this poem to read today because it reflects something I believe so many of our Indigenous communities around the world are grappling with. The question of whether or not we have actually lost knowledge or lost our teachings, or are they still there to guide us? And through the poem, Katy is concerned about the loss, yet at the same time, she carries that knowledge and she shares it with us. It is this tension at the heart of Indigenous values and philosophies that I explore in my research, and I bring forward within a contemporary lens of Indigenous economic development. This is also a quote that I read recently that I think has a resonance with the work and the approach that I take. It's a quote by Lord Richard Laird. He's a professor emeritus of economics at the London School of Economics. And this is a quote from a book called Caring Economics. That is, it's a dialogue between scientists, economists, and the Dalai Lama. So he says, the struggle to raise incomes is to an important extent fruitless. It cannot produce higher happiness. In technical language, we call this a zero-sum game. The total number that can be achieved is fixed. All that can happen is we rearrange who gets what from this total. To raise incomes is therefore not a meaningful overall goal for a society. Many social scientists now think that economic growth ought to no longer be the main goal for Western societies. So in light of this comment that I believe reflects a shift that is happening globally, a question comes to mind. What do Indigenous philosophies have to contribute to the global conversation around economic growth, wealth, and development? In the research that I did for my doctorate thesis, I focus on the context of our feasting and our gathering ceremonies. So why would I focus on the feast economy? What is it about feasting and ceremony that serves economic purpose beyond the transactions that take place? In the title of my presentation, I use a quote from the late Chief Richard Malloway, who said, "When you feed the people, you will never go hungry." In this profound insight, the literal and metaphoric ethic of the Coast Salish economy is captured. By feeding the people through collective ceremonial and spiritual feasting, Coast Salish people will never go hungry, and our survival is assured through interconnectedness, care, affection, relationship, and reciprocity. So in my research, I focus on feasting as a context where Indigenous economics play out. The combination of feasting and ceremony as the backdrop to exchange signals to a philosophy of economy in which the means of exchange are far less important than the ends towards which that exchange embeds people within interconnected and intergenerational networks of belonging. This is what my doctoral research findings show. So I'm going to share, these are my findings. This is one of my findings, but I'm going to show 2 slides of about 20 different findings. So this is only one piece. But I necessarily had to ask the question, how do we define wealth from an Indigenous perspective, and specifically asking the elders that I was speaking to, from a Coast Salish perspective, how do we define wealth? So they told me that wealth is comprised of 2 components, and they're very interconnected. You can't have one of these without the other. So the notion of your lineage, you have to know your lineage, know your ancestors, and know where you come from. So the way that they describe this is that to be wealthy means you know your lineage, and alternatively, if you're not wealthy, to be poor means that you don't have that knowledge. You don't have access to that knowledge, actually. So, and the word for that is stecham. So there's very clear notions of wealth and poverty, and it also aligns with the notion of leadership. So leadership, the word at the top of this slide, siam, we also use the same word for leader. So you're a leader if you are wealthy, because you understand your lineage. The second component is knowledge. So this means, I used the word teachings before. So you have to have knowledge of your lineage, but you also utilize your lineage in order to pass on knowledge for future generations. And so this is where each component is crucially important in order to make up this larger definition of wealth. So another finding that came out of my thesis was the concept of banking. Now, there was a whole series of words and language that was tied to finance, the way we would understand finance now. So the word saving came up, insurance, banking, debt, all of these were interrelated. So, but this notion of banking is really significant, because when we're talking about banking in terms of feasting and ceremony, it has very different connotations. What we're talking about is building in the sense of banking as being able to form a relationship and to be able to bank your resources in other people. So this is why we feast, because we have a series of transactions that need to take place, and we we transact material items, but we're also transacting across generations. And so this notion of banking is an intergenerational concept where the things that are transacted may actually not be returned or reciprocated within your own generation. And this was something that was really clear. It ties quite closely with this notion of debt as well, that when we form relationships, there's often a debt relationship that is implicated, but that actually the reciprocity is something that is returned in future in your lineage. So your children will probably be repaying that debt in different ways, but it ensures that you have those relationships for time immemorial, basically. So here's a good example of the notion of banking, and I'll read this out. So the elder was telling this story. She says, "We had visitors from Vancouver Island, from Cowichan tribe, and this lady was giving money to the people that were going to do a memorial, and they were calling witnesses to the work they were going to do. My dad told my brother and young people, and he said, 'You pay attention to what this woman's doing. She's putting money in the bank, putting money in the bank.' He said, 'She's going to call a witness and tell you what she's doing. And she's giving so much money to these people that are having a potlatch or memorial service. And she wants you to remember that. Whenever she has work to do, these people that she's giving money to have to bring it back and give it back to her and maybe give interest on what she gave you. So they're required to give the same amount or more than what they received. It's like having interest, you know. They put a lot of money in the bank.'" And so we can see this is a different understanding of, well, not necessarily different, but it's when we see this unfolding within ceremony, it's not exactly the same as having a bank account, but it operates in the same way where you're ensuring that your resources are captured for the future. So this is sort of the larger framework that I built into my thesis. What I want to just highlight here is the outside circle largely, which speaks to the sacred nature of our feasts and our ceremonies. And so I built this into the thesis as part of our economy and part of our understanding of economic philosophy, because if we ignore this outside circle, which says that the reason that we feast is because we have an obligation to honor our relationships, not just with people, not just within the bubble on the far right-hand side, huelmoch, so those are people's relationships, but that our obligations to the environment also unfold within the ceremony and the feast as well. And you will also see the obligations and relationships unfolding with regards to Hals, who is our creator, and to this greater sense of spiritual connection to the cosmos and to the universe and to cosmology and the stars and to the sky. So this is where I actually propose in the thesis that if we choose to ignore the spiritual component of our economy, that in fact, I don't think we're talking about a Coast-Salish economy. And so that can be really challenging for our communities, because I think we need to be really clear about whose philosophies we're using to underpin all of our economic activity. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dara Kelly, for those thought-provoking contributions. Please join me in thanking all the three speakers once more. So now we come to the really interactive part of the conversation, and I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for the conversation. Her name is Emilee Gilpin. She calls herself a Métis nomad. She co-leads a series with National Observer called First Nations Forward, dedicates sharing of stories of success, sustainable water and land management, and self-determination efforts in First Nations across BC. So, Emilee, the floor is yours, and we would invite all the three speakers back on the stage as well.
There's lots of Métis nomads these days, isn't there? Just popping up everywhere. Just kidding. Yeah, I'll just chat a little bit while we're getting set up. I'd like to also acknowledge that we're here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Very grateful to have this good conversation here tonight. How's everybody feeling after those great presentations? Anyone have any? Yeah, very good. I think it's very exciting that we're here. We get to hear from some really visionary folks in a very timely way. So I'm very grateful to be on the stage as well. I think it's quite fitting that I'm a moderator here as a Métis person, also very mixed blood person. I'm also of Filipino and Scottish and Irish descent. My family's from Manitoba. I grew up in Ontario, and I've been a nomad for the last 5 or 6 years, living as a visitor in different territories. Out here on the West Coast, out here on the West Coast for the last 2 years or so, where it's been a great privilege to learn about many strong, powerful nations here on the West Coast. The diversity is very different than what I was used to in the prairies and Manitoba and Mohawk territory, where I did my graduate degree at Concordia University. So, hi, Jenny. Jenny's also with National Observer, so it's good to see her here tonight. When I was in graduate school at Concordia, I did a 10-month program in intensive journalism. And one of the things that I realized, as you've heard here from all of the speakers tonight, is that the media doesn't always do such a good job of telling the truth. Or they tell one specific truth, or they share one specific worldview. So I take it very seriously in my work to practice what I recognize as relationship-based reporting and to tell the truth. So one of the examples that was shared tonight was not calling people who are upholding their governing systems and defending their lands and territories protesters, right? Because that paints a picture. So when we change the language, when we tell the truth, we're telling a fuller story. So that's one of the things that I like to practice in my work. But let's change to your questions now that we have them up on the screen here. So, Andy, do you want me to read them off the screen?
I think so, because they're ranking the order of the people.
Sure. So I'm going to read the questions off, and then the person who asked the question, first one is Andy, if you want to follow up with anything after the speakers have, then we've got a mic on the ground as well, so we can run around if you have any follow-up questions or extra thoughts. So we'll start off with Andy's question. How many First Nations communities have transitioned to renewable forms of energy, and how many would be willing to transition to renewable forms of energy?
Hello?
I guess it is on. There's approximately 125 First Nations that are part of renewable energy. And we have a 95% of the 203 that would love to be involved in clean energy.
Andy, did you have any follow-up comments there?
Actually, I have a question that's laid down, and what would be a natural extension. I'll ask it since you pointed at me. I was touched, Judith, by your clear emotion around issues like Site C and the impact on the land and the First Nations of that valley. If we, and I'm struggling to find good words, so forgive me if I stumble here. If we think forward to a world where we have transitioned to, a renewable economy and a renewable energy sources, we're going to need significant number of Site C power plants or their equivalent to power cars, to power transit. It could be solar, could be wind, could be geothermal, but nonetheless significant infrastructure needs to be developed. Site C has been I'm trying to find the right word. Site C has been just run roughshod over the First Nations and the settlers of there. How would you envision that we have respectful, intelligent discussions that lead to mutually agreed solutions on the ground? How do we have that conversation so that when the next proposal for a Site C or a mega solar plant or a wind farm comes up, do we have a responsible, respectful communications and discussions? And how do we get to yes? And how do we get to no if that's the appropriate way to go forward? I would love to understand how we do things better.
Thank you. You know, I don't believe there are any other sites within British Columbia that can build a great big dam. I think they're all gone. And I think there are smaller projects. Site C would have been done respectfully if they had sat down with the First Nations and come to an agreement with them. And if it was no, then that's good. And then we look at what are the alternatives, you know, and for someone who's a clean energy person, we could do that. We could do that easily with all the independent power producers in this province. And the good thing about that is that you can provide power to the grid as you need it. You know, we really do have to find better ways of communicating so that everybody can be on board, you know, because sometimes people want to put up wind farms and they don't want to, you know, their site to be where it's making noise or there's birds, you know, that could get killed in the blades. And so, you know, we really need to find a way to talk with people about how we can address those concerns. But I also think that, you know, in this day and age of reconciliation and the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights, is that it's very clear that the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations is required before this development in their territories. And I think we should respect that and we should start there. You know, if the First Nation says no, then let's look at alternatives. What are they? You know, and that can go for anything. I mean, why are we always in court? I mean, we're back in court on the Chilcotin mine, Prosperity mine. And the courts are saying you got to go ahead with this after they've been turned down 3 times. You know, and then it's everybody who's going to live with the impact of that mine. Yeah, there might be jobs for a while, but what is the long-term future? And I think we really need to sit down as, you know, in a room with people and just talk about that. What are the long-term implications on our health, on the land? Is this something we really want to live with, or are there alternatives? Because everybody else thinks, oh no, there's no more. We can't build any more mines, and we can't do this. We won't have any more jobs. We won't have 9,000 jobs in SNC. You know, there's that mentality that we have to think about. And are there other ways to be creating economies?
Thank you.
We have a hand over here. Did you want to add? Sure. Did you?
I'm just wondering, you're talking about communication and how. I don't know if I want to answer this question, but communication. So renewable energy. Is there like resources or like a group between First Nation communities that exists or could be developed for clean energy? So capacity building, supporting each other in the initiative to do renewable energy, and then in that format also talk about for nations that exist close to each other, how they can work together to build facilities that might function to reduce environmental impacts, like the impact on birds and bats and stuff like that.
So we have a First Nation Clean Energy Working Group, which really is a collaborative group that gets together. There's no structure, there's no money. We just get together and we talk. And a lot of these projects that are being built, and up until a few months ago, the projects that were being built were only as large as 15 megawatts. And so those kind of the projects that First Nations can actually do on their own. There's a lot of Indigenous experts out there. David Isaac comes to mind on solar. And, you know, you can bring in all kinds of people. And there's a lot of companies out there that want to partner with First Nations that have the expertise. So they can build that capacity. One of the best examples I know is Cleoquit, who are in the Tofino area. And they are on building their 4th project. And so the first 2 projects, they partnered with somebody. And then the 3rd one, they did it on their own. And their 4th one, they're doing on their own. And so you learn as you go. How do you do project management? How do you plan? How do you find the financing? So they're easy enough to do. And, you know, and if you've got overlaps or you're working in shared territories, you could do projects together. I know there's quite a few in the out in the valley, Fraser Valley, where there's a couple of First Nations that are working with power companies. So, you know, it's just a matter of sitting down, and it's a matter of figuring out where you can build these projects and how you can do it. But like I said, now there's no opportunity to build any projects other than small ones on community buildings within, and those are easy to do. Like, there's lots of examples throughout British Columbia where First Nations have put solar panels on their schools or on the Heritage Center. And so there's a lot of capacity that's already built. So that's one of the tragedies, I think, of the government just wiping out clean energy, is because through the years we've been doing this. We have these groups called assets, Aboriginal skills, education and training, and money goes into all these different groups. And so for them, they put in place powerhouse training operators. You know, we built courses on how people can come and learn about clean energy. I did a clean energy toolkit. We've built a lot of capacity. We had 2 First Nations groups put together funds where we could actually go get equity. My son here, Cole, is administering a fund from the federal government to help with these projects. The province has the Clean Energy Business Fund. So we've created a lot of capacity, and all of a sudden, you know, bam, not there anymore. I mean, they are there, but what are we going, you know, it's going to be on a smaller scale, much smaller scale.
Moving on to the next question specifically for Dr. Kelly. Would you say that the structure of the First Nation economy has overcome the capitalist economy failing of the tragedy of the commons? If so, how? So the question says the First Nation economy. Does the question mean specifically the First Nation economy that Dr. Dara Kelly has been speaking to? I'm not sure who Lara is. Or do we mean multiple diverse First Nations economies, and have they overcome capitalists? Does someone want to clarify the question? Yes. Hi, Laura. Sure.
Yeah, I do mean specifically the one that you spoke about so eloquently just now, but if you have other examples from other First Nation structures in the economy, please do share those as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so what I didn't present is I didn't present the colonial history behind why there was an interruption basically with our feasting, and it's tied to legislation, the potlatch ban. There was 76 years when we were not allowed to feast. So one of the reasons why I looked at this as a particular context is because when I started to think about economic development, I was thinking, whose economy are we actually referring to when we're doing economic development? And then I also was troubled by the idea that we had economies. So what did that look like? Where, in what situation, what was the context for our economies? And so they've been written about extensively from an anthropology perspective, and largely with interest to the wealth distribution component of these feasts, where there's the status and wealth that you gain is about how much you give away at the end, and so the wealth distribution is hugely important, but. That historical piece is also really important to acknowledge, because what I am also doing is kind of doing a historical tracking of where we were, where we've gone, and what that interruption represented. Because I won't get too much into the theory, but I was using a theory of freedom and unfreedom. And so one of the things in there is about lifting unfreedoms. And so in terms of the way that we used to feast, and then the erasure of our economic philosophy, and then coming into this interest in economic development starts around the 1990s. And I'm sort of going, okay, but this really looks, the story looks like we have not had any economies before this. And so that troubled me, and that's where I started. So if we think about that, our feasts in the Coast Salish territories, we started to feast again in the 1960s. And that was, 1966 was the first feast after the potlatch ban. And so what you also have, and why I put that poem up first, is because what we're actually doing and what we saw throughout Coast Salish territory was like a triangulation of information throughout the territories, where you had Musqueam communities talking with our communities up the river, talking with Squamish communities, and everybody's trying to take the knowledge keepers, take the knowledge of the elders, and start to put together our practices around our feasting and gathering. And so I have to explain all of that, because it's not so easy to just say, okay, we've got economies now, and have they taken over the capitalist economy? It's what we're seeing is just a whole communities are kind of piecing together that whatever resilience is still there, resilient knowledge is starting to come forward. And so we are feasting. My community had a feast in April of last year. I attended a feast up in Haida Gwaii in April of 2017. That was enormous. We're starting to see that, and we're starting to see very explicit messaging within the feasting practices and protocols as well around, there was a message from Gadansta up in Haida Gwaii at a feast, and he said in his gifting of coppers to other hereditary chiefs, he said, I give you this gift, it's without expectation of reciprocity, but I do expect that you will also host feasts in your community. And so it was, the gift was not actually something he gave hoping to get something directly back. It was a gift and almost a message to say, this is our source of wealth. And I'm giving you this copper to encourage you to use your wealth, to express your wealth and engage with your wealth as well. And so in that sense, we are starting to see more feasts across BC. And I think it's really beautiful. I think it's really exciting. We start to see all of that knowledge coming through. But yes, it's not sort of overtaking how we transact within the global market.
Do you want to ask that question? A follow-up question I have for you. You said that during the potlatch ban and other times that Indigenous ways of life and ceremonies were made illegal by different governing bodies of Canada, that there was obviously a disruption. To your knowledge, was there much underground feasting? Because I know, like, I attended a ceremony, a Cree ceremony this past summer, and we talked a lot about how some of the law lodges and ceremonies and practices just went underground for a time being, but never actually stopped. Yeah. So this idea that there's a resurgence is certainly true, but that there's also has never ceased to exist per se.
Yes, I would absolutely agree. So Richard Malloway, who you saw on the slide, he was one of our knowledge keepers who did not go to residential school. He was fluent in Halkomelem, and he was basically hidden by the elders. They just, every time that the priests and nuns would come by to pick up the kids, they would hide him and make sure that he couldn't go to the schools. And so he is a knowledge keeper who, as he grew older, he became a source of wealth because he had that all of the knowledge that was about our sacred ceremonies and about why we conduct ceremony within a feasting context. And so, yeah, so there's more than Richard. He wasn't the only one, but people who can speak to that knowledge will often reference who they learned that knowledge from, and so he's a source of authority because of that lineage that he carries. So yes, so absolutely that came through in a lot of the interviews as well, was the underground activity. There was elders who made decisions that instead of passing on knowledge in a feast, they had to basically violate Indigenous law and pass on knowledge in private. It was a violation of our laws because we had oral history practices. But they made that choice because the choice also was, do we lose our knowledge and our teachings, or do we do this underground and sort of illegally within the Canadian legal framework? We're going to do that outside, and we're also going to do it outside of our Indigenous laws that say knowledge is valid if it's witnessed in public, if it's witnessed in front of other people. That's how you know that a transaction is valid and legitimate. So yes, the underground activity is really interesting.
The Indian Act forbade any of the potlatches, feasting, sundances, all of that. And so in many cases, people went on and did their cultural activities and dances. If you were caught, they took all your regalia and they put it in museums around the world, private collections. There were actually 17 people in Alert Bay that were put to jail. And if they were willing to give up their regalia and not do it again, they were released, but there were actually some people who refused to do that. And so the thing about that is that the settler people didn't really understand that this was our economy. This was, you gave all your stuff away, you redistributed the wealth, and then somebody else did it. And they didn't understand that. They thought, why are you giving all your stuff away? This is really wrong. And so they placed their values on us. And it was really unfortunate.
Switching, Cliff, did you want to talk, Dr. Atleo? No. Okay. Switching gears a little bit. Folks are curious as to where the majority of the clean tech projects from the 125 First Nations who are funded, where do they get that funding from? Is it government subsidies? And is BC Hydro taking that away, or is it private funding? And perhaps I'll add to that, what are some challenges for some First Nations interested in clean energy to access funding, all the levels of funding that they need to access for a successful project?
Okay, so, when we built the China Creek project, it was $13.8 million. We found $4 million in grants and free money. At the time, there was a matching equity program that they had with the Department of Indian Affairs, as it then was. And so we had raised $2 million, and they gave us $2 million. And we had all sorts of other grants. And believe me, it's not easy to get some of these grants in the proposal writing. So a lot of First Nations do have that proposal writing, but we still have to come up with our equity, and we still have to come up with our capital. So if you've got a good project, if you have an electricity purchase agreement with BC Hydro for 20, 25, 40 years, that's what the bank uses as your collateral. So we went to the bank and we got $9.8 million in a loan. And that's what First Nations have to do. And sometimes it's hard for First Nations to come up with equity. And that's why we started a couple of equity funds in British Columbia. The New Relationship Trust had one with a couple of other Aboriginal capital corporations. And then there was the BC, one of the capital corporations also with EcoTrust are administering a regeneration fund. So you could actually go and finance your equity. So you'd have your equity, go to the bank and get the rest of the capital. Because as long as you had a good project, you had an electricity purchase agreement, the banks would give it to you. But that wasn't always true in the early days, because a lot of the banks didn't understand clean energy. So you'd have to educate them and get them on side. But nowadays, they all know what it is. Mm-hmm. So there are still some grant programs out there. But there's, like 150,000, 50,000. It's not a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And that's where our partners come in. Mm-hmm. Kanaka Bar built a great big 50 megawatt project with Interjex. And they have, I think, 25% of their project. And then when the loan's paid off, 50% of the project. When the loan's paid off, they get 100% of the project. Mm-hmm. And so there's some creative financing in there as well. Mm-hmm. But the company that they partnered with was willing to do that. Mm-hmm. So you got to be creative, you got to be innovative. And there are some pots of money out there, but they're getting harder to create now because there's no opportunity, and you're not creating the same economics. You're doing smaller projects. But we were able to talk the federal government into putting more money into this clean energy fund I was telling you about. But it's getting harder. Mm-hmm. Because there's not the same kind of ability to make money and jobs as it used to be in capacity building. Mm-hmm.
Cliff, I'm going to ask you this question here. It's a question that I find a lot of Canadians like to ask. I find this on the social media sphere. But what does sitting down with First Nations mean? Some First Nations are pro-projects and some are against. How should each nation's opinion be weighed? So again, that some agree, some don't, some are for industry, some are for clean energy. We hear that conversation happening a lot. How would you respond to that?
The first thing that I tell people is Indigenous people are tremendously diverse. Mm-hmm. Often, whether it's by the provincial government or the federal government, we often get treated the same. Historically, the media has always treated Indigenous people as some sort of monolithic group. And I always tell my students, I tell people on the radio, Indigenous people are as diverse as anybody else. We will disagree. The three of us here will disagree about certain things, and that is actually just normal human behavior. I hope I'm not shocking anyone with that. But I think to your other point, it is definitely an issue that I'm interested in. So the Squamish Nation, for example, has been very outspoken and opposed to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Mm-hmm. They are also partnering on the wood fiber LNG project. Mm-hmm. So some people might see this as contradictory. I don't necessarily see it in such black and white terms. I'm very interested in what the Squamish Nation feels about it, the conversations they've had with mm-hmm. governments, they've had with corporations. Mm-hmm. How have they seen these moves, both moves, as expressions of their autonomy or as mm-hmm. expressions of their self-determination? Mm-hmm. So I think I always tend to back up a little bit to recognize the fact that Indigenous communities have always asserted their jurisdiction. There's been sort of ebbs and flows. There's been times where we've gone underground. But if you look through history, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs has this amazing sort of research document. It's called something like Stolen Lands, Broken Promises, I think. It's about, basically it's a research timeline of before Captain Cook, who was a Spaniard. 1774, Spaniard came, he just hung out for a couple days and then left. And then Captain Cook came in 1778. He stayed for a month, and it really sort of transformed the relationship on the West Coast. But they document, like year by year, all of these events and sort of conflicts and attempts to negotiate. You have the early the missions to England that the Niska did, and all of these efforts throughout time. Despite all of these changes, there was this continuity of assertion of self-determination, which I think also people have difficulty these days in conceiving of in any real way beyond the abstract. We just think of Canada, BC, Vancouver, and sometimes wonder how a community of 200 people or 2,000 people has some sort of right to self-determination. And I would just like to remind people that we've never given that up. And in terms of reconciliation, we want to see some expression of our autonomy and our ability to make decisions. And that if we start from that point in discussing whether it's environmentalists or whether it's governments or whether it's corporations, I think it's a better starting point to recognize that. A mutual respect, if you will.
And you mentioned that sometimes these issues are seen in very black and white ways. So I've found that in my work as well, in relationships as well, that sometimes we think that because folks are not supportive of a pipeline, that it's because of the pipeline itself rather than the very weak and unconstitutional consultation process that invited First Nations to engage over the decision as well. So I think you're right. I think we need to expand our understanding sometimes of these issues and what we're speaking about. But I have a follow-up question for you around self-determination. In your understanding, would you say that self-determining efforts are a means to an end, or self-determination is the end itself?
I think in some ways I would probably describe it as an end itself. How it's expressed, there's many different means about how it's expressed. And so you see communities like the Wet'suwet'en who are certain clans within the Wet'suwet'en who are asserting on the ground their self-determination. You see other communities like Nuu-chah recently, I think, talked about a title case, or the Tsilhqot'in case, or the first Delgamuukw case. There are many different strategies that people can employ. And I think those are all various means, and they're up for debate about whether they're effective or not effective. But I think at the end of the day, each community, whether they have a traditional governance structure or a contemporary governance structure, still continue in all of their efforts, whether it's legal, government to government, or, like I said, through economic development or business, are trying to assert that autonomy.
I just wanted to go back to your consultation accommodation. So in 2005, the Haida case came down from the Supreme Court of Canada, and basically what it said is the government had to consult with First Nations on any development in their territory, and that the bigger the impact, then the more say the First Nation would have. So when people say, oh, well, 6 out of 10 First Nations agree on Trans Mountain, it's not about a scorecard. It's about what's happening in the territory of the First Nations, even based on the consultation accommodation model. So here, Tsleil-Waututh, Burnaby, North Shore, you know, their worry is that when Trans Mountain comes through, they're going to be double twinning the pipe. They're going to be doing it in their territory. Their sea resources at risk, both with the facility and the chance of spills, plus, you know, coming through their territory. Some First Nations might have a pipeline that's coming through their territory right through their water source, or right through a sacred site, or right through a fishing area. And they have a greater say than somebody who, you know, say, okay, well, this pipe's just coming through. It's not going to hurt us. We're not worried about it. And that's what time when you have First Nations signing on the line, you know, because they're not worried about the impacts. But for other people, you know, it could destroy their whole way of being and their whole territory. And so you see them fighting a lot more, going to court, doing whatever they have to, you know. And I think this whole issue of consultation accommodation, it gets to be the government that decides how big that impact is. So the First Nation can say, you know, this is how it's going to affect us, and we don't care. The public interest is the most important. That's what we heard in Trans Mountain. That's what we heard again about the orcas. The public interest is the most important over orcas, over, you know, that. And it's the federal government that has all that power. And that's why First Nations really push for self-determination. They push for free, prior, and informed consent, because there's too much discretion in the federal government. So when people start throwing numbers around, and, you know, 22 First Nations have signed on to Trans Mountain, and the hereditary chiefs are saying no, and they're only one First Nation, there's something wrong with that. And that's a whole different story. But that's what you really have to tune into, is what is the impact on that First Nation that's saying no. There's a reason. And I think Dara or Cliff talked about, well, you know, we have our laws, and our laws are saying yes.
I want to ask, there's a couple questions here around so-called reconciliation. So folks want to know what reconciliation looks like. So maybe we could just go along the line. There was another question as well. Is there hope? What can we do to help change? So people want to know, leaving this room, how we can support Indigenous nations, Indigenous self-determination, clean energy, other than following along the First Nations Forward series, of course.
What is reconciliation?
It's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm one of these people that, like I said, Trio talked about decolonization. I don't even think we're close to talking about decolonization. That's a much too high a bar. In terms of reconciliation, I think I conceive of it as a reestablishing or a rewriting of a relationship. And one of the things, so as Judith mentioned, I used to be an employee of the Tribal Council, and I used to be involved in treaty negotiations. And when the Nuu-chah-nulth initialed an AIP in 2000 or 2001, I remember I had just started. I was on the job for like 2 months when that happened. And I remember the federal negotiator getting up, Dan Goodleaf from Ganawage, and I remember Trevor, I can't remember his last name, the chief negotiator for the province. And I remember them getting up in public and talking about how difficult this process was, the give and take and the sacrifice. And I almost vomited in my mouth a little bit because these platitudes were completely disingenuous. It was just like this public show to say how difficult this was. Like the negotiations, like that's actually what happens when you have equally matched partners and they're trying to figure out a compromise. And what I learned from that in retrospect was that when you look through history, Indigenous peoples are asked again and again to compromise, and then compromise again, and then compromise again, and then compromise again, and it never seems to end. Recently, just 2 nights ago, I was at a panel at the WASC Center regarding something called the Eat Lancet Report. Has anyone heard of the Eat Lancet Report about healthy diets and food production sustainability? Essentially, it's saying by 2050, we're going to have to feed 10 billion people. We're going to have to radically change our diets and our food production systems with respect to climate change, with respect to health. It's going to require a lot of sacrifice. And what I think, honestly, reconciliation means in Canada is Canadians learning to cope with the sacrifices that they're going to have to make as a collective body. Certainly some individual sacrifices, I think, but as a collective in terms of the political will of their leaders and their parties and their governments, it's going to have to require actual sacrifice and some realistic acknowledgement of what Indigenous rights and title and all of these things that we talk about, what they really mean in terms of transforming the relationships in Canada.
Thank you. I think reconciliation is whatever the First Nation wants. What is it going to take for them to feel like the federal government has made amends, has settled with them? And I think number one for many First Nations is settling on the land. You know, in British Columbia, there's very few treaties. The land is still ours. It was never taken in a war. It was never given a treaty. It was never, it wasn't discovered. And where are we in resolving title? Chilcotin had to go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, over 5% of their territory. And 5 years later, we still don't have an idea of what that title means because of the provincial and federal governments and the Chilcotin haven't come to an agreement. Well, as far as I'm concerned, if you've got Aboriginal title to the land, it's yours. You can do what you want with it. But the governments have a hard time letting that go. So I think reconciliation has to come from the First Nation, and they have to decide what that's going to be and to negotiate that. you know, as far as people that are concerned, I think you need to be talking up more. You need to be telling your MLAs, your MPs, you need to be telling them, you got to sit down and work this out with First Nations people. We have uncertainty in this province. We have people out on their lands because this is how strongly they feel about it. You know, we have problems over the Trans Mountain. You know, I mean, we may always have those, but it might be less. I think one of the most devastating things about the Trudeau government is that he made so many wonderful promises. I mean, he made it sound like the promised land almost. That these things were, you know, because he was going to implement the declaration, which with us was, you know, that'd be recognizing our title, that'd be recognizing free, prior, and informed consent. He was going to reconcile with us. He was going to recognize our rights and implement them. And he was going to keep us out of the courts. Has he kept any of those provinces? No. Not many. You know, the only thing I see him really have kept his promise for is the Missing Bird Indigenous Women's Inquiry. There's not an awful lot out there. And so when you make promises to Indigenous people, keep them. You know, don't just say the words. Put the action behind them. And if you guys don't see them doing that, then, you know, you need to organize. You need to stand up with Indigenous people and say, you know, we support them in what they're doing here. And I think until we get that kind of support, that reconciliation will never happen. And you know, it has to happen. You know, we've been fighting at this a really long time. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
I tend to look at reconciliation in terms of relationships. So I think that came through probably a lot in the research that I did. It's a relational economy, basically. But I also think that extends to the way that we relate to one another as human beings. So for me, reconciliation really is about looking deeply at discourse and the way that we talk to each other, the language we use. These are all choices we make. We make choices about how we choose to ask questions. We make choices about our body language, and I think that there's a lot of violence, which is a lot of aggression that goes back and forth, and we see it play out in the media, and we see it playing out in so many different arenas. So from my perspective, I think across the board, we all really need to check the language that we use and the discourse that we're using, and making sure that we're not making things worse and being violent in the way we treat one another. So, and I think that personally, that's something that I take it really seriously with students, and I take it really seriously in the approach that I use within a teaching environment, that encouraging students to pay attention to that, and how because I speak from experience of being a student at UBC. I did a video in 2007 about the violent conversations we experienced. There was a series of us Indigenous students who experienced a lot of violence in the classroom. And the impact of that is it affected our learning, it affected our self-esteem, it affected our choice to participate in classroom discussions, and that's just in quite a monitored, safe environment. So when we get out into the world, this violence continues, and I think even if you don't know, like there's a lot of anxiety as well, and I've heard this from many of my colleagues, that there's anxiety about not knowing the history of Canada, or not knowing enough and being afraid. But I don't think that's the issue. It's not about what you know. It's about how you go into that conversation and how you're willing to engage and learn and be open. So that's from my perspective what reconciliation is about.
Andy, did you want to point to a specific question here? Okay. What does a healthy interaction between a spiritually rich First Nation economy and a non-First Nation economy, what does a healthy interaction look like? Perhaps look like. What does a healthy interaction look like between a spiritually rich First Nation economy and a non-First Nation economy? is there a particular scale that this works better on? Do you understand that question, Dara? Do we want clarification?
I think I sort of get the question. It's kind of reaching at what I shared today about the philosophy of our economy. What can that actually translate into? That would be my interpretation.
Does anyone want to clarify the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, because what I shared is very much it's a philosophy, and so this is asking the question of a why of economy. But of course, the next steps are thinking about the how of the economy and how does that actually translate. I think we have a long way to go because. Like I said, there's so much knowledge that is still coming forward, and we're still trying to piece that together. And it's not always clear, even within our communities, how that's going to look. But like I say, the comments I just made about the spirit of intent that we bring into our conversations and discourse and dialogue, I think that is about building a relational economy. It's about the way that we are relating to one another, because in the feasting context, what shows is your good relationships. That's the entire premise behind building your network, is that if you also don't have good relationships, then you end up being impoverished in terms of that sense of, you don't have knowledge, you don't have good relationships, you're not able to form those relationships of debt and saving and banking. And so that's how I see those concepts we can bring that into any way that we transact. And it's not always about the material transactions we make, but that sort of larger sense of the way my mentor puts it in New Zealand, so a people-centered economy and a relational economy is about building up that end picture. What are we transacting for, and how are we doing that? So yeah, I hope that answered.
Can I?
Yeah, jump in.
From that? Yeah. I was very taken with your thoughts on economy in your presentation. And if we transcend from the sort of theoretical and academic to the everyday practical, in the communities that have built their own energy sources, renewable sources, in these your First Nation communities, is there a sharing or feasting, to use your language, of the energy, the value and the wealth that comes from that energy into the community, so everybody has perhaps equal access to that energy, or the profits from it being sold into the grid come back to enrich the entire community? Has there been a First Nation contractual economy-based sort of discussion, or is it very much still defined by the relationships that you had to make with the bank to just make even the project tick? Is that thesis transcending into a day-to-day use of the energy? Because forgive me, I have this very Star Trek-y, to pick up on Cliff's point earlier. If we had access to true free energy globally, it is the opportunity to eliminate poverty and ensure food and water security, shelter security for everybody. You kind of got a little microcosm going on, right? When you're in your off-grid communities. Is this economy that you speak to manifesting in your energy economy? Or do you see it emerging?
Kind of makes me think of Souk First Nation. Do you know what they're up to? So I think when you're building a clean energy project in a community, you are probably using services from, you need people who's going to help you build. So you're contracting with people. The Souk First Nation, for example, is one of the leading communities in solar. So they learned all about solar, and their whole community is solar.
and they train their members. And so now what they're doing is they're sending their trained members to go install solar in Colwood and all the surrounding communities. And so they're helping people to do the same thing that they did. And so they're trying to make a business out of it. They have, I don't even know what you call them, clean energy tours. People come out to the community and they're all learning about it. And I think that's how you, that sharing of knowledge between the two communities is, nobody really knew what a run-of-the-river project was when we built ours. So we told them about it, and then they all were stepping up to the plate and wanting to help let us use the city roads. They would grade the city, and so it's sometimes the outside community kind of looks at you and thinks, "What are we doing here?" We were trying to build an interpreter center on the waterfront in Port Alberni, and we were building a walkway by the river, and there's no other walkways in Port Alberni on the river. And, when the Old Boys Network came up and offered us a donation, I knew we'd made it. Because they wanted to support us. They wanted to be part of us because, we were helping to build Port Alberni into a tourism destination, which still needs work. But so when you can provide that kind of interaction between the two communities, when you want to support one another, when you can work together, when you can agree to disagree on some things, and you will, because your values are not aligned. But it's being able to share that knowledge that you get, and it's quite awesome, what can actually happen, and how you can do that. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it's great. Thank you. I've got one more.
One more question. So let's end on a positive note and ask each of you, there are a couple questions here connected around your visions and hopes for the future. If you, feel free, just what would your vision and hope be, either for yourself, your nation, for Canada, for the world?
Well, if I'm holding the mic, I can start. So my vision for my home community, for the Nuu-chah-nulth community, for the outside world is that we can catch a falling sky, that we can mobilize ourselves, the country, to do mitigation, to do adaptations, to stop climate change as much as we can. Mm-hmm. I mean, we may never be able to do it totally, but what can we do to mitigate the forest fires that have ravaged our, are the things we can do in prevention. So my vision is that, we all recognize that global warming is a reality, that we're all mobilized to work together, that we'll look at solutions that are for the greater good. And they're not just because of jobs, they're not just because of money and capitalism. It's because we need to keep this world for future generations, for 7 generations, whatever. And that we have to change our way of life, all of us, if we're going to be able to save it for our children. And what are we prepared to do? And I think once we all make that kind of a commitment, then we can catch that falling sky, that we won't have to fight every step of the way to stop destructive projects that are only going to add to the greenhouse gases and to the global warming situation. I mean, we just had the coldest February on record, and I'm sure March is heading into it. There's snow on the ground. I'm driving from Port Alberni to Nanaimo, and there's snow on the ground all the way. I mean, when have I ever seen that? Ever. Except for maybe a day. Things are changing, when it hits 40 for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, there's something wrong when the rain doesn't fall like it used to. And I think that recognition, my vision is that everybody recognizes that, and that we all say it's time to change.
Thanks, Judith. I mentioned Glenn Coulter at UBC. One of the things that he's written that I included in my dissertation, actually my conclusion, he says, for Indigenous nations to survive, capitalism must die. I don't know what kind of crowd I'm working with here, so. Sometimes I end up working with or talking to a billionaire apologist crowd for whatever reason. stop picking on...
This is a safe place for dangerous ideas.
But he doesn't just stop there. He says, in order for that to happen, we must work together to build alternatives. And that gives me a certain degree of hope. And I think if I would qualify his statement as well, I would probably say unrestrained capitalism. I think we could probably all agree that unrestrained capitalism and massive accumulation of individual wealth doesn't really work out for anybody in a positive way. So there you go. I think what this does, and what I was trying to emphasize with my earlier comments, was that it will require sacrifice. It will require change, significant change, to the comforts that some of us have become accustomed to. A different way of thinking, a different way of, I mean, I really loved Dara's, when she was talking about the language of banking and investing and reciprocity. I think we need to start heading in that direction, and I'm hopeful, with people protesting the pipeline, but also people that are trying to work hard to develop alternative energy, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, working together. Because if, I talk a lot about Indigenous autonomy, but I'm not like a hard sort of, nationalist that wants to shut out the rest of the world. I think we need to all be strong and work together, which I think we can do. But I think this also requires a lot of change, not only to our politics, but our how we conceive of economics and how we conceive of wealth. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So one of the ways of thinking that I really love is to think, try and break this session we have with linear time, mm-hmm. And to really think in terms of cyclical time. And one of the reasons for this that I really I think also about the scale and of time as well. So if we think about Indigenous economies and gifting economies as being 15,000 years old, actually this interruption that we've had of, if we're generous, 200 years, is such a small blip within that 15,000 year history. So if we actually think also about the knowledge that cycles through the generations, that gives me hope, because that makes me think, okay, we have 500 generations before us, and it's only been, what's 200 years? I don't know, divided by 30, whatever generations that is so small. And it has been devastating, and it has hurt a lot. There's no question about that, but it's also something that makes me really think that this knowledge is still there. The resilience of our communities is unbelievable. And the knowledge of elders, but also the knowledge of the young kids, of being able to carry that knowledge forward. That's where we're at today, is that all of those young people who were sitting with the elders, who were able to preserve this knowledge, those are the people now that we look to. And so that's the unbelievable strength of being able to hang on to things and philosophies that are old. This is ancient knowledge. So recognizing that ancient knowledge is also a place that we can look, and we should look, to be able to help us out of this. So yeah, so I really like thinking about that big time frame. There's a few communities in New Zealand that are looking at 500-year time frames. They're planning for 500 years in the future. And one of them has been saying, we were here 500 years ago. We plan to be here in 500 years. That's all there is to it. So I think that's really hopeful. I think that's great.
Thank you. That's some really good bits of advice. I know I'm thinking a lot about how you're talking about to re-examine our relationships and all that we do, our relationship-based economies and all of our work, and Judith saying that there are very pragmatic ways that we can pressure our political parties to uphold some of the projects that have been shared here today and push for more education and more justice in all of our relationships as well. And then also being prepared to recognize what sacrifices we might have to put forward, which in some ways might not actually be sacrifices at all if we do reconceptualize wealth and our place in all of it. So, hi, thank you so much. Thank you.
Just come back. So it just remains for me to close out the evening and say thank you to our panel deeply. I don't quite know how to find the right words, but your thoughts have really resonated, and I've got a lot of thinking to take away and think about tonight. I deeply appreciate your words and your thoughts. Thank you. So if you could care to join me one more time on behalf of Simon Fraser University, the Pacific Water Research Centre and Science World, we thank you so much. Thank you.